Welcome to Hand in Hand, Place to Place, Transforming Teacher Preparation. I'm Valerie Sakimura, your podcast host, a mom of three, lover of the outdoors, gourmet cooking, and of course, teachers and teaching. I'm also the Executive Director of Deans for Impact, a national nonprofit with a mission of ensuring all students access well-prepared teachers. We're launching this podcast to commemorate 10 years as an organization. Over the course of 5 episodes, we'll be examining how has teacher prep evolved over the last decade? Where is it headed? And how can stakeholders work together to ensure all pathways into teaching are affordable and high quality? Today, I am so thrilled to introduce my longtime colleagues, Benjamin Riley and Peter Fishman. Ben was the driving force behind the creation of DFI and its first executive director, and Pete and I joined him as it officially launched in 2015. Ben, Pete, it's been over a decade since we first started talking about the need for change in teacher preparation. I remember many conversations, Ben, with you over Skype. That's how you know it was a decade ago. It was Skype we were using then, as we drafted out the business plan for DFI while you were on a fellowship in New Zealand. And Pete, many conversations with you in our Austin office amidst the filing cabinets full of old yellow page ads that we inherited from previous tenants. Sometimes we focus so heavily on the present and what needs to change, but it gives immense perspective when we pause and look back to see the work we've done. Ben, Pete, can you say a quick hello to our audience and then a fun, maybe loaded question to get us started? What was top of mind for you as we were launching DFI in 2015? And Ben, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, here's the quick hello to the audience. Hello, audience, and hello, Val. Hello, Pete. It's good to see both of you again. So I would say there was a lot of things that were at the top of mind with the start of Deans for Impact. One was the sheer terror of the concept of starting a new organization. The actual creation of an organization and the creation of jobs and asking people to move, to physically relocate, and to say that, like, we're going to actually try to build something together. It's incredibly exciting and it's terrifying. I was terrified that I was going to do this thing or try to do this thing and fail at that. There was huge waves of relief that I felt when both of you agreed to join and essentially serve as de facto co-founders of the organization, because I knew both of you had spent more time than I ever had thinking about what it would take to do that. And the fact that we're having this conversation now is proof that I got that decision absolutely right. The other thing I would say that was very much at the top of mind was, well, what were we going to do? Like, we had this group of deans that had come together and started to have conversations, but now we were going to try to formally organize. And it was sort of like, yes, but organize to do what? And so it was a really big question about how much of what Deans for Impact would and is doing would sort of reflect existing dispositions, we might say, of leaders in the field versus how much of it would be sort of pushing those leaders in the field and trying to drive transformation and change.
Yeah, that tension between the organization and the field and who's kind of leading the agenda or setting the agenda, I think is one that's stayed true over time. Pete, say hello and tell us what was top
Hello.
of mind for you in 2015.
Yeah. Thanks, Val, for pulling this conversation together. It's good to see you both again. I was thinking about a lot of different things, but one of them was, I was coming immediately from doing some work in Colorado on teacher development and teacher career pathways. And specifically, we were in the sort of implementation days of Race to the Top policy reform. So Race to the Top was, 2010, 2011, and those laws then were like getting implemented in the same years that we were launching Deans for Impact. And I had just been working on implementation essentially of teacher evaluation reform positioned as teacher career pathways in Colorado, and seeing how teacher reforms anchored on like outcomes and accountability could actually be really promising for teachers. So I just experienced like some really exceptional teachers get additional compensation, get really recognized for the expertise that they brought into teaching and the way that they like moved life trajectories for kids. So really positive things. but also all the like downsides of outcomes and accountability only reform where it doesn't actually lead to improvements in teacher practice, because there isn't a mechanism to actually improve like what happens within the black box of teaching and learning and what happens in classrooms day to day. And thinking about as we launch Deans for Impact, this tension between a deep belief in sort of needing to anchor on outcomes with also a belief that that alone can't move teacher practice. And if we want to actually move the system of educator preparation and transform teaching and learning, we have to attend to like the details of teaching and learning. And that was some of the really fun work that we got to get into with the deans and with some of their faculty, and especially among our team as we were launching Deans for Impact.
I'm curious, Pete, as you think about really from the earliest inception of the organization, what's something that you think has been in the DNA and that has turned out to be really important as the organization has grown and the field has evolved?
Yeah, we talked a lot about DNA throughout, and it's like DNA that really informs the direction of organizations and teams. And one of the I mean, there's so many, but one of them was like this commitment to being a third way organization. We talked about teacher preparation as being defined by a group of individuals and organizations that sort of were circling the wagons and just sort of defending the status quo, to another group of organizations that we won't name here that were all about burning it down and we don't need teacher preparation, just let's burn it all down. And we were trying to sort of create something in the middle, third way. And I think that third way orientation transcended just that sort of dynamic in the field. We were trying to be a third way between theory and practice, like not saying that theory didn't matter, but also not saying that practice didn't matter, but bringing together theory and practice. Ben would often quote Stanford University professor named James March, who talked about a lot of things that informed Deans for Impact, but one of them was the idea that leadership requires poetry and plumbing. And we were trying to bring together the poetry of change, the stories of change, with the plumbing of like systems and structures, and do those two things together. So I think that like third way orientation was about a lot of different things. And I get the sense it stayed true to Deans for Impact throughout its history.
Pete, the burn down the system, I think, is back with a vengeance.
It never went away, though. I'm not sure it ever went away.
It never went away, but it feels very present right now.
Yeah, well, Pete, you obviously know how to make my heart soar by quoting Jim March. And it's funny because I think where I was going to go was very similar, and sort of I can bring in another thought from Jim March, which is that he's written this brilliant essay way back in 1975, talking about what education really is. And what he describes is that inherent to the act of education is optimism, that it is about something where there are consequences and outcomes that derive based on whether or not you become educated, but there is value, and our identities are formed through the process of becoming educated, and that to do that, to pursue that, is inherently optimistic. It supposes a human will, as he says. And I think that that is something that we tried, and I believe built into the organizational values of Deans for Impact. I think it's reflected, if I'm remembering correctly, and if it's still a value, sometimes these change, but always seeking solutions. And I remember one of our founding deans, big heavyweight in the field of teacher education, a man named Bill McDermott, who was the dean of the School of Education at UNC Chapel Hill. And I remember him saying that for many of the gatherings and things he went to with people from teacher ed, it felt like a circle the wagons mentality. And the reason for that is the very thing that, Val, you were just alluding to, it sounds like might be resurging again, or at least being sort of the omnipresent story that is told about schools of education in this country, which is that they're not doing well enough and right by the students and the system. And there's reasons people say that, and I think you can't dismiss those stories. I think Deans for Impact wouldn't exist if not for a recognition that things do need to change and improve. But at the same time, I think one of the fundamental things that we have learned from a scientific perspective about education is that it's very hard to do that when you start from a place of shame and of blame and of not seeing the capacity for growth and change. And I'd like to think that deep within Deans for Impact, there's a belief in that, both in terms of every individual, every student, but also the organizations that are responsible with the task of preparing people to be teachers.
Now, what would you say?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind really kind of chimes off of what you both were saying. From the inception, the idea was that this organization was going to represent leaders from all types of different organizations and pathways who shared a commitment to doing better for teachers and for kids. And I think that belief in this big tent and getting people from across the fields with really different contexts and different opportunities and different constraints to work together to think about how each of them can play a part in this solution and how together they can move forward faster. I think that's turned out to still be really powerful. And as we see just changes in where people go in order to get additional training or to get certified for Deans for Impact, it doesn't matter the organization type of where a teacher is prepared. We want all of those places to be accessible, to be high quality, and to be committed to putting out teachers who are really going to be able to see and lift up and honor kids.
It's funny, Val, to hear you say that, because I was just thinking how at the beginning of Deans for Impact, it's a little bit of a, inside the conclave story, but one of the founding deans of Deans for Impact was Mamie Hostetter at Relay Graduate School of Education. So when you talk about, you sort of alluded to it, but when you talk about new programs, Relay was a program that frankly many saw as threatening to the traditional order. And it was, even within the deans of Deans for Impact at its earliest stage, there were some eyebrows raised at whether or not someone like Mamie should be included in the conversation. Well, here we are now, fast forward a decade, and she has just been named president of a university. I believe it's Hamlin in Minnesota, if I got the name right. We were not responsible for that. Mamie Hossetter is an extraordinary individual and would have gotten there on her own, but we recognized that her leadership and what was happening in an institution like Relay was something that was worth celebrating, paying attention to, and bringing together the insights and skills that they had, along with people who were coming from other institutions, so-called traditional institutions, who also had great insight and had, the experience of working in rural Texas or, urban Chicago. We had folks from all of these different sorts of places in the United States. So it's been very gratifying for me to see the leaders who are part of that, you two as well, sort of go and continue to sort of try to do great things and to sort of support the transformation of the system. I think it comes from that diversity of leadership and of communities that were served.
It's almost like we planned this all out, like what was going to happen into the future. And yet, if we put ourselves back in those early days, there are moments when it was really challenging. There were a lot of things that we were trying to figure out and navigate through. Lots of opinions in the field about the organization and what we were trying to do. And it wasn't easy. I'm really curious to hear what you all remember about those early challenges. What stands out as something that was particularly tough to navigate through. And then if you have something, kind of a moment where you really knew or felt, okay, we are onto something really important here.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe picking up what I started off with and sort of the the gap between the organization and the deans. I think a big challenge was sort of, even from the very earliest days, is that we had different reasons were motivating deans to join Deans for Impact or want to be part of Deans for Impact. So for some, they were really interested in improving the quality of experiences that someone who's going through the preparation process to become a teacher is going through. Others were more interested in influencing policy and trying to change the policy environment. And others were frankly more interested in just trying to change the narrative of what the stories that are told. And so those were not all the same thing, and trying to figure out within that how we would sort of advance and move forward along all of that. Sometimes when some of those things were a little bit in tension with each other was definitely a challenge. One of the things that I would like to think is deeply in the character of Deans for Impact, the organizational mission and values, was to focus on bringing sort of scientific principles into the aspect of training somebody to become a teacher, preparing them to become a teacher, and also looking to pursue policies and to communicate that there's a lot of complexity to teaching, but we have some insights. And if we can sort of connect, as Pete said earlier, the theory to the practice and have both of those held side by side, maybe we can make some good progress. And I would like to think we have made good progress on that. I would like to see more progress being made on that. But that was certainly a challenge from the outset.
The Science of Learning is a report we published. It's our very first report a decade ago that's trying to synthesize and distill the research in cognitive science as it applies to teaching and learning and give implications for teacher practice. And Ben, I think this is kind of what you're describing about bringing those two pieces together. Now there's so many organizations that talk about being grounded in evidence and grounded in research. How do you think about discerning organizations like Deans for Impact that have really been committed to that research base and that evidence from the outset, to others that are kind of just tossing around buzzwords like evidence and research?
I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I don't want to monopolize. So Pete, you want to offer your thoughts first?
Yeah, let's hear your many thoughts on this, Ben. We know you have many thoughts on this topic.
And Ben, I'll just cut you off.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. How much time do we have?
5 thoughts.
Yeah.
Go.
Well, in a way, Val, you just kind of encapsulate it, because and in the pre-warm up for this conversation, you had said, evidence. And it's like, I actually don't use the word evidence very often unless I'm forced to, because I think there is an important distinction between science and, quote, evidence. To my way of thinking, what makes a discipline scientific is when you sort of, in the very classic Kuhnian sense, establish some principles and paradigms through which people sort of agree these are the main problems that we are trying to investigate. These are the presumptions that we think we can validate. And that's where the evidence comes in, from looking and observing and sort of, testing in the classic scientific sense. And then from that, we develop a vocabulary that we agree describes some aspect of the world that we can then work on together in order to get and make improvement. The challenge that it's not unique to schools of education, but I think it may reach its apex within them, is that there's a lot of evidence that can be used to support just about any different claim that you want to make. And so people can grab hold, and they do grab hold of that banner and sort of say, look, I've got evidence to support this. And it's like, well, that may be so, but it's going to be hard to know whether what happened in that particular circumstance is applicable in this other particular circumstance. And two, even if you think it does, we haven't settled on a common vocabulary. And so translating from that context to the new context, if we're not, putting it into the discourse of science, I think makes it really, really hard. So I think what we tried to do with the Science of Learning was to make some very clear statements about, here are the principles from cognitive science about how people learn. Let's be very explicit about that and tie them as directly as we could to explicit teaching practices that we thought would foster those. And from that, start to build around those principles and those ideas into things like, okay, so how do you do that within the structure of a school of education or a program that prepares teachers? What does that look like? How do you build practice-based opportunities that give you the chance to work on applying the principles in the very different context in which education takes place? All right, cutting myself off there.
Well, but this is, it's been a huge part of Deans for Impact's work, is to think about how to take those principles and then actually infuse them into the practices of teachers in ways that will show up in the learning experiences for kids, right?
I think so many efforts to improve teaching and learning at scale don't get inside the black box of instruction. And I think what, the science of learning enabled us to do was to think really deeply about the scientific basis of how the mind works and think about model of the mind, but then able to translate that to like details of teaching and learning. And I think one of the early challenges was that people have people being, including leaders of educator preparation programs, don't necessarily want to go inside the black box of teaching and learning and instruction, maybe because they don't have confidence in their own sort of background and expertise, which is very fair. Some people don't come into the work of leading an ed prep program because they have a background in teaching and learning. They might have a background in sociology or political science or fundraising or any number of other disciplines, but not the details of teaching and learning. One thing that we did early on was a series of learning visits to the programs that we worked with across the country. And in those learning visits, we would sit in teacher education classrooms. We would also go out to K-12 partner schools and sit in K-12 classrooms, and not like quick observations in there and out in 5 or 10 minutes, but sitting for the entire class period in a teacher education course on a university campus, the entire class period in a K-12 school. And we invited deans in the network to come along with us and to sit in classrooms and observe instruction and then debrief and talk about instruction. And I remember we were out, there was one dean, Cassandra Herring, who was then subsequently a dean in residence with us and went on to launch a phenomenal organization, the Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity. And she came on some of those early learning visits with us. And I remember we were out at University of Texas Permian Basin out in the oil fields of West Texas. They have a replica of Stonehenge, full life-size replica of Stonehenge on the campus of UTPB. And I remember sitting in that Stonehenge replica with a couple of our early staff members and Cassandra, and she said, after spending time in classrooms, teacher education classrooms at that university, but at some other ones as well, because she'd gone on a couple visits, she's like, I got to get back to my campus and I need to observe courses. I need to observe instruction. I do not do that enough. And I think we've had a lot of leaders in educator preparation who, prior to their work with Deans for Impact, weren't spending time in classrooms, either K-12 classrooms or university classrooms. And that shift towards like actually engaging with the details of teaching and learning has been like a really significant one. And I think that was the moment of like, oh, we're actually onto something, because we're getting inside details of instruction here. And we're not just sort of treating it as this thing that we don't really talk about.
It kind of ties back to what Ben was talking about, the challenge he named about navigating different places where the early member deans wanted to focus, whether it was on policy or on data or practice. I think, Pete, what you're naming is that actually we need to be working on these things simultaneously and they inform each other, right? That we need to be supporting leaders to be looking at instruction. We need to be ensuring that policies that we're advocating for are in support of instruction. We need to be supporting teacher educators to think about the policy environment and yet really be focused on the details of teaching and learning. And it is by pushing on all of those simultaneously and in a coordinated fashion with each other that we're going to advance the field. And Pete, I think you're right that at that time it was really unusual for leaders to be, and still quite countercultural for leaders to be in their faculty classrooms observing what's actually going on and how teacher candidates are being instructed.
Like before we had all launched Deans for Impact, what we haven't talked about is we also worked together in a previous chapter. And part of that work, at least that I've been involved in, was bringing together traditional and non-traditional ed prep programs into the room together to talk to each other. And I remember doing that once and literally having them go to separate corners of the room and not actually talk to each other. Literally the traditional ed school deans being on one corner of the room and the Teach for Americas and teacher residency programs being on the other, like not talking to each other. And the fact that we now have 10 cohorts of like these Impact Academy fellows who represent the truly wide diversity of programs and pathways into teaching, collaborating with each other, learning from one another. That's like a significant change, I think, with a long, long way to go to truly actually move the needle on, outcomes for students at scale.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing to see these Impact Academy Fellowship cohorts where there is a little bit of that, Pete, what you described about different camps when we launch each cohort, because these leaders operate in really, really different contexts. And what I love is seeing over the course of our time together, even in the course of the first day that these leaders are together, the kind of crossed arms and leaning back posture slowly kind of melts away over the course of the day, and people start leaning in and realizing as they talk to each other that while there are a ton of things that are different about these different contexts, there's also a lot that is the same, and there's a lot of value in bringing these leaders together to talk with each other. I think we're getting close on our time, which is sad. I wish I could just hang out here with you all day today. That would be lovely. But I want to give each of you a chance for a final word. What is the single most important way you think the field has made progress over the last decade? And what do you think is important for us to be paying attention to as we continue this work over the next decade?
There is, fascinating to me, a sort of worldwide movement happening around sort of improving education by bringing insights from science into the system. And there are nations like England that have really worked at that for like a decade to make that part of their system. And there are other.
And we're really big in
Well, that's
the
the
UK,
point.
by the way.
Huge.
Yes, that's it. And that, I mean, we've always joked about it, but it's really true. And the reason I'm saying that it's both a joke, but also an impetus, I think, is that it shouldn't be that Deans for Impact has outside influence in these other countries. It should be that Deans for Impact is just one of a whole movement happening in the United States. And I'm starting to see little signs of it just this morning. I don't know if you guys have checked your text messages yet, but just this morning, I saw an interview done by the author Natalie Wexler describing that, we need to get beyond the science of reading, which has had kind of a moment over the past 5-8 years, and look at all these other insights from science and use those. And she cites one organization as doing great work on that, and that organization, Deans for Impact. And so I think the both for the individual organization, DFI, but also for this country, it is going to be absolutely vital that we see that spread and to see what other places are doing actually happen here. That's a charge that I think should still fire up everybody who's Deans for Impact related.
I'm fired up then. Pete, what about you? Biggest progress over the last decade? What to pay attention to as we look ahead another decade?
I think over the last decade, it's hard to argue with data around educator diversity in the United States increasing, at least at the front end, together with an expanded number of pathways into teaching. So that if you want to become a teacher, you can find different ways to become a teacher. There's an expanded number of pathways today that there weren't 10, 15 years ago, some led by leaders within Deans for Impact, others sort of newly launched by leaders within Deans for Impact. And I think provided that those are strong, high quality pathways that also expand access and affordability into the profession, those are generally good things over the last decade. But at the same time, overwhelmingly, the sort of state of the teaching profession in the United States has been declining for the last 10 or 15 years. And like 15 years ago, like 3 out of 5 teachers said they were very satisfied with teaching. And today it's like 1 out of 5. It's like a dramatic shift in the way that people are thinking about the state of the teaching profession. And so I think the work ahead is how do we both strengthen pathways into teaching and ensure that every beginning teacher, for instance, has a strong grounding in principles of learning science and the ability to make those come alive in like rigorous grade level work that students are engaged in. But they have to also be doing that in roles that they can sustain in over time. And so I think it's this work of like ed prep programs, pathways work, partnering together with systems to redesign the way that we sort of organize learning consistent with principles of learning science. And like we're seeing, I think, some early glimmers of some progress, but to Ben's point, like it's not happening fast enough right now, and it's not happening in the United States, at least, with enough sort of, I think, commitment on the part of policymakers at the state and federal level, and even at the local level as well.
Pete, I was thinking about what you're saying about the black box of instruction. And I think when I think back over the last decade, I think the field has moved quite substantially to recognize that getting inside that black box is important. Now, sometimes that's done in ways that I don't know are necessarily good for the system, but I do think policymakers and leaders, and sometimes even the public, are paying more attention to issues of teaching and learning that are occurring within teacher preparation. And I think maybe I'm being a little too optimistic, but I do think there is a growing recognition that teacher educators, those that train teachers, need support and development and capacity building in the same way that we think about providing learning opportunities for K-12 educators. Pete, you mentioned there are more and more pathways, but I think there's still room for imagination in how we create programs where the economics work for both kind of the employer and the teacher candidate. Because right now I think we are seeing some really high quality programs that are also extremely expensive. And we see some programs that are doing amazing things in terms of reducing costs and other barriers to those wanting to enter into the profession, but question mark on the quality of the preparation that those teacher candidates are getting. And so I think it's possible to create a program that is both affordable and accessible, and that is preparing teachers in the way that we want them to be prepared to go into a system, Pete, as you were describing, that has different roles for educators where they can see themselves over time. All right, this has been incredibly awesome. Thank you so much for being here. I had so much fun going down memory lane with the two of you. To our listeners, if you're still here, thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe to this podcast. Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Pete.
Good to see both of you.
Thanks, y'all.